Hey Fret fans, Scott from Fret Props here, and today we're going to be unboxing and setting up our motor starter kit. So the kit comes in a box just like this. We'll have a label here on the front with a QR code that you can scan to see a video on how to use the PicoVolt controller that's included inside. Let's go ahead and open it up and see what comes with the kit. We always like to include goodies with our orders and our shipments, so you might find a sticker or something like that inside. You will find your motor here, which is in its own little box. And you will find a power supply as well. This is your 12-volt, 5-amp power supply. And, of course, the PicoVolt controller itself, which is what's going to allow you to program the movement of the motor. And you never know what other kinds of weird goodies you'll find in a Fret Prop shipment. Motor comes in a box like this. Pop it open. Here's the motor inside the box. And then also a bag with the motor shaft arm, motor mounting nut, and then some mounting bolts as well. Take the motor out. All right, so the motor comes like this. There is a label here that tells you what the wires are. So your red is positive. There are two negative wires, a blue and a green. Blue is for fast speed and green is for slow. And then your parking wires here. And those wires are here at the end. And we'll go ahead and show you next how to wire this to the PicoVolt controller. All right, so here is the PicoVolt. We can go ahead and open up this box. The PicoVolt controller will be inside. Comes with an operating manual here. This will show us all the wiring that we need to attach the motor to the PicoVolt controller itself, as long as wire up any triggers and go through the setup of the controller as well. Here's the controller itself. You can see the motor connection here. The power supply goes in here, and then these are the connections for your triggers. There are two trigger inputs here, so you can technically have two different triggers. And then here on the top is the dial for programming and controlling the motor, and your record and play button. So here in the manual, if you look, we have the motor and LED wiring. You can actually use this controller for LEDs as well, or linear actuators. We're going to be using it for a motor. So you have kind of two options. If you just want to control the motor speed and direction, you can just wire up the red and blue wire. You do want to use the high speed wire when you're using a controller like this, because you want the motor to be able to move as fast as possible if it wants to. If you want to use the park feature, which we'll be doing today, you can go ahead and wire it like this. So red into plus, blue into negative, and the yellow wire into park. The other two wires are not used in this setup. All right, so we're going to go ahead and take the motor, and we're going to wire it into the terminals here. So first, we're just going to make sure that they're backed out. Use our screwdriver here, just to make sure that they're not tightened down, so that the wires can fit into the screw terminals. And then we'll just wire as per the diagram. So we'll do red into the positive screw terminal here. Again, we'll be using our high-speed blue wire for the negative. And for our park feature, we're going to be using the yellow wire. In this case, the green and the black wire aren't used, so you could either cap them with a wire nut or just clip them off. Probably capping them with a wire nut's the best option. All right, next up, let's go ahead and install an arm on the motor so that you can see how this works once I power up the controller. We'll get our baggie here with our motor shaft arm and our mounting nut. Go ahead and take this off, place it onto the motor spindle there, and then use the motor shaft mounting nut to secure it into place. I'm just going to hand tighten this for now because we may want to adjust this position depending on where our park is, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, now we can go ahead and power up our PicoVolt. So we'll grab our power supply from earlier, pop that out. We have the power supply itself here and then the power cord here. Go ahead and remove the protective plastic from the prongs. We can plug the power cable into the power brick here, like so. Make sure it goes all the way in and clicks into place. Then we can go ahead and plug this into our wall outlet here off screen. And we'll plug the barrel connector here into the PicoVolt to power it up. All right, so the PicoVolt will go ahead and power up, and we can actually use it right now to move the motor arm. So if you wanted to just use this as a speed controller, you could do that. You could actually just set the speed of the motor and let the PicoVolt run it in one direction at a set speed. Or if you wanted it to move the other direction, just move the dial the other way. If you wanted it to be faster, just turn it up. So at its most basic, the PicoVolt is a really good motor speed controller, but it can do a lot more than that, of course. In order to take full advantage of the PicoVolt's features, we're going to have to go through and set the output and the input modes here. So to do that, we need to enter the settings. In order to do that, we're going to power down, and we're going to power up while holding the red button until we see the LED flash green. Then we'll be able to let go and enter the settings menu. All right, so now we are in the settings menu, and you'll see this LED is blinking. And the number of blinks actually tells you what mode you're in. There's 5 different modes to choose from, and by adjusting the dial here, you can change how many times this light is blinking. So now you'll see it blink once and pause. That's for our first mode, which is our default mode. That's, again, if you just want to use it as a speed and direction controller, you can do that. The next mode is the transition mode. So we'll go to where we get 2 green blinks. This mode is called transition, and it just basically more gently transitions the motor between the directions and speed that you set with the dial. The next mode for 3 green blinks is the park mode, which will actually utilize the park function of the motor. And then the fourth mode for 4 green blinks is the park mode with brake. And the brake, rather than just cutting the motor off right when it hits the park, will actually coast it to a stop. And that's the mode we're going to be using today. The last mode is for LED lighting. So the 5 green blink mode you can use for LED lights. So we'll go ahead and make sure the light is blinking 4 times and then pausing for our option number 4, and then click the button to select that. All right, so the next mode here is actually for your trigger inputs. So you have 2 trigger inputs here, and by default, they're going to be normally open and not interruptible, meaning that if a show is triggered on input 1, while that show is playing, input 2 won't be able to trigger it. That's a setting we're going to use most of the time. There are other settings here if you want to actually make them interruptible or use them in some other ways, and the manual has information on that. So we're going to go ahead and turn our dial here until we just get 1 orange blink, and hit the button to select the default operating mode. All right, the lights will blink to tell us what options we have chosen. And then the motor is actually going to park because we're in park mode. The park position is actually a factory set position in the motor. So right now this motor is parked, and that's where it's always going to stay. So if you want to adjust where the motor arm stops, you just need to remove the motor nut, turn the motor arm, and then refasten the motor nut. And then once you're happy with that, you could use a wrench to really tighten this down and make sure it's nice and secure. So now we've made it so that whenever this motor parks, that motor arm is going to stop in the down position. We can now go ahead and program the motor. What we're going to do is actually program it so that the motor spins, and then once it stops, it's going to kind of coast to a stop here in this same position. And to do that, we're going to use the record button, and all we're going to do is record whatever animation we want. We're just going to make sure we stop the animation when the motor arm is not in this position. So any other position but this one. Otherwise, it kind of messes it up. So in order to do a recording, we're going to go ahead and hold down the record button here on the controller until the LED starts blinking red. We'll let go, we'll act out our scene that we want to record, and then tap recording into save. And then you see at the end, the motor went back around and parked. So if we wanted this to be something like a lid that opens, we can go ahead and hold down the record button, use the dial to open our lid, our fictional lid here, and then start to close it and hit record again, and it'll stop at that same position. So say that's your lid open, start coming back, hit record, and it will park in that same spot. Now, anytime this controller is triggered, it will just repeat our programmed animation. One other thing to note here is that you will notice that if I move the dial now that we're in the park mode of the PicoVolt, it won't actually move the motor arm. So that's normal. So sometimes that can be a little bit troubling to people. They're like, it's not working anymore, but that's designed to work like that. So once we have our program to our liking, we can go ahead and install a trigger. All right, so lastly here, let's go ahead and wire a trigger to the PicoVolt. So we're going to be using our motion sensor here, which is one of our most popular triggers. You can get any of our triggers with this kit as an optional add-on. Let's go ahead and open this up. Here we have the motion sensor mounting bracket, so you can mount the motion sensor to your wall. Here we have the sensor itself. You can go ahead and remove that from the bag. This is probably our most popular sensor for a couple of reasons. One, it works in the most conditions. It works great in pretty much any haunted house condition. It's not affected by fog, works great in the dark, of course, and it's just a nice, reliable sensor that works in a lot of different conditions. The sensor has 4 wires here, a black, a green, a red, and a white. And the cool thing is that the PicoVolt is actually labeled here. So you can see, if you look at the PIR indication here, that if you're wiring a PIR sensor, your white and black will go in negative, your red will go in plus, and then depending on if you're triggering input 1 or input 2, your green wire will either go into 1 or 2. So we're going to go ahead and just wire this sensor in like that. Of course, there's also a diagram here in the manual if you need to reference that. The motion sensor itself also comes with a manual, so that will actually give you some information on the field of view and how you can kind of limit that if you need to, some of the technical specifications. On the back, you'll have wiring diagrams for our common controllers, and then, of course, a description of the circuit board and some of the jumper settings that are available on the sensor itself. All right, so again, we're just going to follow the wiring instructions on the PicoVolt itself. We're going to wire white and black into the terminal here. We'll wire red into plus, which is the next one over. And then we are going to be using only trigger input 1 here. So we'll wire the green wire into input 1. All right, and we can now power the controller back on. It'll go ahead and boot up. You'll see the motion sensor comes on right away. This is also actually normal. Basically, the way these work is they need to warm up. So it's going to trigger right away as soon as we plug it in. And you'll actually notice that the PicoVolt, though, is not triggering. That's because, and you see this blinking light here, it's actually ignoring the trigger input. You can see here that if you see if you see a blinking yellow light, that's indicating a trigger delay. So what the PicoVolt's doing now is waiting for this trigger to warm up before it actually allows the unit to trigger. If you want to bypass that, you can go ahead and just hit play. Now, of course, the sensor here is actually still on, so it triggered again. But now you can see the LED light has turned off. We can go ahead and trigger the sensor with our motion, and it will play our recorded show. All right, so that is a quick look at our motor starter kit with the PicoVolt controller, our dual speed high torque prop motor, and a motion sensor. Of course, if you have any questions, you can always leave a comment on this video or send us an email at sales@fryeprops.com. Thanks a lot.